Black Hollow was the kind of town that seemed frozen in time, tucked deep into the woods, surrounded by swamps that never quite dried up. It felt like a place the world had forgotten. The streets were narrow and uneven, lined with houses that looked too old to be still standing. Paint peeled off in long strips, windows sagged in their frames, and yet people carried on as if none of it mattered. Outsiders rarely visited. Those who did never stayed long. Some claimed the air felt heavy there, as if you were breathing in more than oxygen. Others noticed the silence, the kind that pressed against your ears until you couldn't take it anymore. Black Hollow had its own rhythm, one that was slow, quiet, and unsettling. Like a first glance, life there looked ordinary. Children played near the cracked sidewalks, their laughter echoing against the leaning fences. Men sat on porches in the evenings with bottles in hand, staring at nothing in particular. Women exchanged gossip at the corner store, their eyes always darting as if making sure no one overheard too much. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and secrets never stayed hidden for long, even though no one spoke them aloud. What wasn't said often mattered more than what was. There was something else about the town that outsiders never understood. In Black Hollow, nobody seemed to live past the age of 30. People whispered about it, but never directly. A few claimed it was a curse, an ancient punishment whose cause no one remembered. Others believed it was bad luck, or maybe something in the water. Yet for the people who grew up there, it was simply part of life. They didn't question it. They married young, had children even younger, and tried to squeeze as much as they could into the short time they were given. Birthdays past 25 were celebrated like miracles, though the laughter at those parties always carried a nervous edge. Among the families that lived there, some stood out more than others. The Harrisons, for example, were respected but feared. They owned most of the land near the swamp, land that no one else dared to claim. The patriarch of the family carried himself like a man who knew something others didn't, and people treated him carefully, never wanting to get too close. Then there were the Langfords, a family known for their tragedies. Every generation seemed to lose someone young, often in strange or sudden ways. The townspeople pitied them, but behind closed doors, they whispered that maybe the Langfords had done something to deserve it. And then there were the children, the ones who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of the clock that ticked above everyone's head. They ran wild through the woods, fearless and unaware, though the adults always called them home before the sun fully set. That was the unspoken rule in Black Hollow. When the light faded, you stayed inside. People didn't go out at night unless they had no choice. Even then, they moved quickly, heads down, as though the shadows themselves might be watching. The town was quiet most of the time, but it wasn't peaceful. There was tension under the surface, the kind you couldn't see but could always feel. Couples fought behind thin walls. Old debts lingered. Friendships cracked under pressure, though no one admitted it. Families kept to themselves, clinging to what little security they thought they had. Every person seemed to be carrying something heavy inside them, something they never dared share. It was in this atmosphere that a handful of lives began to circle each other in ways that would end in ruin. A young man who seemed destined for more than the town could offer. A woman whose beauty made her both admired and despised. A child who saw things he should never have seen. They moved through their days as if nothing unusual was happening, but the truth was that their stories were already tangled together, their paths leading to a moment no one in Black Hollow would forget. Even in their most ordinary routines, the cracks were there. In the way the young man stared too long at the horizon, as if he wanted to escape but couldn't. In the way the woman smiled, her eyes betraying something colder beneath the surface. In the way the child whispered to himself at night, saying words that weren't his own. These were the signs that something was breaking, though no one noticed until it was too late. Life in Black Hollow gave the appearance of normalcy, but it was only a thin layer. Underneath was a constant hum of fear and control. Fathers who ruled their households like tyrants. Mothers who swallowed their anger and wore smiles like masks. Children who grew up too fast, already aware of how fragile everything was. The town itself seemed to feed on that fragility, as if it thrived on taking pieces of people away bit by bit until there was nothing left, that it wasn't any single event that set things in motion. It was a slow build, like a storm forming far away. You couldn't see it yet, but you could feel it, the air growing thicker, the silence between people stretching longer. In the small moments, in the quiet glances, the unease was there. Something was waiting. Something was coming. And in Black Hollow, where no one lived past 30, it was only a matter of time before another story would be added to the long, tragic list. The quiet rhythm of Black Hollow began to shift, almost unnoticeably at first. The days still dragged on. The swamp still breathed its thick, damp air, and the town still carried its silence like a second skin. But beneath it, something was stirring. The Langfords and the Harrisons, two families who had long circled each other with suspicion, found themselves crossing paths more often. Some said it was a coincidence. Others believed it was fate. Whatever it was, every encounter seemed to carry more weight than the last, as if the town itself was pushing them together. The young man, Daniel Langford, carried himself with a restless energy that set him apart. He was 26, old by Black Hollow standards, living in borrowed time. He had the look of someone who refused to shrink under the shadow of the town's curse. People noticed his hunger, the way he worked long hours at the mill, yet still talked about leaving one day, moving beyond the borders of the swamp. To the townspeople, that hunger was dangerous. It was seen as defiance, and in Black Hollow, defiance always came with a price. That Daniel's ambition wasn't his only burden. He had fallen for Eleanor Harrison, the daughter of the most powerful man in town. Eleanor was 23, beautiful in a way that both drew people in and unsettled them. Her dark eyes never revealed what she was thinking, and her smile often seemed like it was meant for someone else. To the outside world, she lived a charmed life in the Harrison estate, but those who paid attention knew she was as trapped as anyone. Her father dictated everything: who she saw, what she wore, how she carried herself. Her future was already decided. She would marry someone her father chose, someone who would strengthen the Harrison name. Their attraction was dangerous from the start. Whispers about Daniel and Eleanor began to weave through the town like smoke. They were seen too close together near the riverbank, too comfortable in each other's presence. The Harrisons denied it. The Langfords kept quiet, but the truth was hard to bury. And in Black Hollow, nothing fueled tension faster than forbidden love. That Eleanor's father, Henry Harrison, was the kind of man who controlled not just his family, but the town itself. He owned land, the mill, and the store. Most people owed him something, whether it was money, work, or silence. He noticed everything, and when he began to hear the whispers about his daughter, his anger grew cold and sharp. He warned Eleanor once, then twice, but she didn't listen. Each time he caught her sneaking away, the punishments grew harsher: locked doors, stricter watch, cutting off her visits into town. But Eleanor had tasted a freedom she wasn't willing to give up. The town began to take sides quietly. Some pitied the young couple, seeing their love as the only light in a place so heavy with dread. Others saw it as reckless, doomed from the start, something that would bring ruin not just to them, but to anyone close to them. And in the background, the Langford curse seemed to stretch its shadow further. Daniel's younger brother had drowned mysteriously the year before. His mother had taken her bed in grief and rarely rose. His father drank himself to silence. Daniel carried that weight with him, a constant reminder that every choice he made was pressing against the edge of fate. The tension only deepened when money began to tighten in the town. The mill cut wages. Crops failed in the shallow soil. Families who had little to begin with found themselves on the edge of nothing. Henry Harrison, who had the power to help, tightened his grip instead. He raised rents. He charged interest that no one could escape. His control was like a noose, and Daniel, already burning with resentment, saw it for what it was. His love for Eleanor became tangled with anger toward her father, until it was hard to tell which drove him more. Eleanor herself began to change. The weight of her father's rule pressed harder each day, and with it came a darkness in her eyes. She spoke in whispers to Daniel about escape, about burning it all down, about a life somewhere beyond the swamp where no one could tell them who to be. But beneath her desperation was something sharper, an edge of cruelty, a thrill in imagining her father powerless. At times, Daniel wondered if her love was as pure as he wanted to believe, or if she was using him as a weapon against her father. Their meetings grew riskier. They met in the woods at night, where the shadows seemed to swallow their words. The child who had once whispered to himself, the neighbor's boy, barely 9, saw them once through the trees. He said nothing at first, but his silence grew heavy. He had been taught that secrets were dangerous in Black Hollow, and the weight of this one began to twist in him, making him restless, making him speak strange words in the dark as if he was trying to let the secret out without telling anyone. The more Daniel and Eleanor pulled toward each other, the more the town seemed to pull against them. Daniel's mother, weak in her bed, begged him to stay away from Eleanor. She warned him that the Langfords were already cursed, and that loving a Harrison would only make it worse. Henry Harrison, on the other hand, began to tighten his surveillance. He sent his men to follow Daniel, to corner him, to remind him that his place was in the mud, not near the Harrison name. Each encounter chipped away at Daniel's control, feeding the anger that simmered inside him. And then there were the smaller moments, the ones that seemed almost unimportant but carried weight. The way Eleanor laughed too loudly at one of Daniel's jokes, even as her father's men glared. The way Daniel clenched his fists when he passed Henry in town, unable to hide the fury in high. S.I.'s. The way the neighbor boys' drawings grew darker, filled with strange shapes and faceless figures. These were the quiet signs of something building, pressing closer to a breaking point by late summer. The air itself felt charged. The heat lingered longer, the nights stretched thicker, and people whispered that the swamp was restless. Daniel and Eleanor had reached a point where there was no turning back. They had crossed too many lines, broken too many rules. Their love, once tender, had twisted into something heavier, part passion, part defiance, part desperation. And the more they pushed against the boundaries of Black Hollow, the more the town seemed ready to push back. What began as longing was now obsession. What began as a rebellion was now a war. And as each day passed, the distance between a dangerous love affair and a crime no one could escape grew thinner, until it was almost gone. The night of the crime did not come quietly. A storm had been building all day, swelling in the sky above Black Hollow, pressing down on the town with a weight that no one could ignore. The air smelled of rain and iron, the kind of smell that made your skin prickle before the first drop even fell. The swamp sang its low, constant hum, frogs croaking, insects buzzing, but even those sounds seemed uneasy, as if nature itself knew what was about to break loose. Daniel had not planned to go to the Harrison estate that night. At least, not at first. He'd told himself for days that he needed to stay away, that every step closer to Eleanor was another nail in his own coffin. But obsession had its own rhythm, and it beat too loudly inside him to resist. He had been drinking just enough to give him courage, not enough to blur his focus. By the time the storm cracked open, lightning splitting the horizon, he was already moving toward the estate, boots sinking in the mud as he gripped the knife he had carried for weeks. The Harrison estate loomed at the edge of town like a warning. Its windows glowed faintly against the storm, but most of the house sat in shadow. Eleanor was waiting. She had slipped him a note earlier that day, passed through the hand of a child who didn't know what he was delivering. Come tonight. It has to end. Her words were simple, but Daniel understood. This was the night they would either break free or break apart. Inside the house, Eleanor's hand shook as she lit a single candle in her room. She wore a pale dress, the kind her father approved of, but her hair hung loose, wild, as though she had torn it free in a fit of frustration. She had been pacing for hours, whispering to herself, imagining all the ways this night could end. Her father had locked the doors, as always, but Eleanor had long since learned the secrets of the house. She knew which boards creaked, which locks gave way with the right pressure. She also knew Henry Harrison was awake. He never slept easily anymore, not with his daughter slipping out into the night and his power fraying around the edges. He sat downstairs with a glass of whiskey, his gun within reach, listening to the storm with the patience of a predator. Daniel climbed through the side of the house, rain slicking his hair to his forehead, his breath heavy with adrenaline. He fell. N.D. Eleanor waiting, her eyes burning with desperation. For a moment, they embraced, their bodies pressed tight, the storm outside muffling their whispers. But the relief was short-lived. Heavy footsteps echoed from below. Her father's at Henry's voice carried up the stairs, low and sharp. Eleanor. It wasn't a question. It was a command. She froze, her hand clenching around Daniel's arm. They had been caught. When Henry appeared in the doorway, he looked more like a shadow than a man. The candlelight flickered across his face, hard and unyielding. His eyes narrowed at the sight of Daniel, and something inside him snapped. He had tolerated many things in his life, but this betrayal by his own daughter, cut too deep. He reached for the gun at his side. The room filled with heat, the storm's roar muffled by the blood pounding in Daniel's ears. In that split second, Daniel knew there was no way back. He lunged forward, knife flashing in the candlelight. The blade caught Henry across the shoulder, sending him stumbling, but it wasn't enough. Henry fired. The shot cracked through the house like thunder, shattering glass and silence alike. Eleanor screamed, her hands clamping over her ears as if she could block out the sound. The fight that followed was brutal, stripped of any elegance. It was rage against control, desperation against power. Daniel's knife slashed again, his hands trembling but determined. Henry fought like a man who had ruled his world for too long to let it go. The storm rattled the walls as the two men collided, grunts and curses breaking through the thunder. Eleanor stood frozen, her eyes wide, torn between terror and exhilaration. Part of her wanted to scream for them to stop. Another part wanted to see her father fall, wanted to see the weight that had crushed her life finally lifted. Her breath came fast, her nails digging into her palms, blood bead. ING where the skin broke. The final blow came in silence, as if the storm itself paused to watch. Daniel's knife drove deep, sinking into Henry's chest. His eyes widened, not in fear, but in disbelief, as if he could not accept that his power had finally failed him. He staggered once, reaching for his daughter, and then collapsed onto the wooden floor. The room went still. For a long moment, all that could be heard was Eleanor's ragged breathing and the storm raging outside. Daniel dropped the knife, his hands slick with blood, his chest heaving. He looked at what he had done, his stomach twisting, bile rising in his throat. There was no triumph in him, only a hollow terror. Eleanor sank to her knees beside her father's body, her face unreadable. Tears didn't come. Instead, she touched the blood pooling beneath him, her fingers trembling, then smeared it across her white dress as if to mark herself in it. She turned to Daniel slowly, her eyes blazing with something he couldn't name. Relief, hatred, love, madness. Maybe all of them at once. The aftermath came fast. The noise of the shot had already drawn attention. The servants stirred, doors opened, voices called. Panic rose in Daniel like fire. He pulled Eleanor to her feet, whispering, begging her to leave with him. But she didn't move. She stared at her father's body, her lips curling into something like a smile. "It's done," she whispered, her voice calm in the chaos. "It's finally done." Daniel couldn't understand it. His hands shook as he tried to drag her toward the window, desperate to escape, but she resisted, rooted in the moment as though she had been waiting her whole life for it. The sound of footsteps grew louder. Someone was coming. When they finally fled into the storm, the house behind them lit with voices and lanterns, and Daniel felt the weight of the crime pressing down on him. Every step through the mud was heavier, his mind racing. He had wanted freedom, but all he had now was blood on his hands. Eleanor walked beside him, steady, almost serene, her pale dress ruined, her hair plastered to her face by rain. She didn't look back. The crime was done, but its shadow stretched long. Panic would ripple through the town by morning. Denial would follow, then whispers, then blame. But in that moment, with thunder rolling above them and blood still wet on their skin, Daniel and Eleanor were caught in the silence that comes after chaos. A silence that carried with it the weight of everything they had destroyed that BY morning. The storm had broken, but its damage lingered like a bruise across Black Hollow. The Harrison estate stood heavy in the gray light, its windows cracked open, curtains flapping with the wind. Inside, the blood had already dried dark on the wooden floorboards where Henry Harrison had fallen. His body, stiff and pale, was surrounded by whispers. Servants huddled in corners, afraid to speak too loudly. Neighbors, summoned by the sound of the gunshot, stood just beyond the gates, clutching their coats as if the morning chill was sharper than usual. News traveled fast in Black Hollow, faster than it should have. By noon, everyone knew Henry Harrison was dead. Some said he'd been shot in a robbery. Others claimed his daughter had finally turned on him. But the truth, the sight of Daniel Langford fleeing into the storm, bloodied and frantic, spread like fire. The Langfords had always carried the stain of tragedy, but this was different. This was murder. Daniel couldn't go home. He had stumbled through the swamp with Eleanor until the sun rose, his clothes soaked, his hands still trembling. His mother's house was too close, too dangerous, and he couldn't face her eyes. Instead, he hid in the ruins of an abandoned cabin on the edge of town, his chest burning with every breath. He couldn't wash the blood off. Every time he tried, it seemed to seep deeper into his skin. Eleanor was calm in the aftermath, disturbingly so. She had returned to the estate at dawn, her white dress stained in red, her face pale but composed. When the sheriff questioned her, she spoke in short, careful sentences. She claimed Daniel had broken in, threatened her, and killed her father in a drunken rage. She told the story with such steadiness that even those who doubted her hesitated to say so aloud. After all, she was Henry Harrison's daughter, and the town had long been trained to respect, or fear, that name. Her composure unsettled people. Some whispered that she was in shock, that the horror had hollowed her out. Others suspected she was lying, that she had lured Daniel into the house and set him loose like a weapon. But no one dared challenge her openly. Instead, they mourned Henry with the kind of exaggerated reverence they often reserved for the dead, forgetting the cruelty he had inflicted on them in life. His funeral became a display of loyalty, a chance for the town to prove it still bowed to the Harrison legacy, even in its grief. For Daniel, the days that followed blurred into one long nightmare. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. The weight of what he had done pressed against his chest like a stone. He replayed the moment of the knife sinking into Henry's chest again and again, each time hoping it would change, each time finding it exactly the same. He told himself it had been self-defense, that Henry would have killed him if he had. He struck first, but the justifications rang hollow. He hadn't just killed a man. He had killed the most powerful man in Black Hollow. The sheriff began his hunt quietly at first, but it didn't take long for the search to spread. Daniel's name was whispered on every corner. The Langford family became pariahs overnight. His mother wept in her bed, her grief spilling over into rage and despair. She told anyone who would listen that her son wasn't a murderer, that Eleanor had twisted him, used him. But few believed her, and even fewer cared. The Langfords had always been marked. This only sealed it. Eleanor, meanwhile, grew sharper in the wake of her father's death. She walked through the estate with her chin lifted, her presence commanding in a way it had never been before. Some said she looked like her father, that she had inherited not just his wealth, but his coldness. She visited the sheriff often, pressing him to capture Daniel quickly, her voice cool and deliberate. She claimed it was fear, that she couldn't rest until her father's killer was caught, but behind her eyes was something else, a hunger, a satisfaction in how events had unfolded. The town itself is split down the middle. Some called for Daniel's immediate hanging if he was found. Others whispered that Henry's death was long overdue, that Daniel had only done what many had dreamed of. Still, no one dared to say those words too loudly. The Harrisons still held the land, the store, the debts, and with Henry gone, Eleanor now held that power in her hands. For Daniel, The guilt gnawed at him until it consumed him. Alone in the cabin, he began to hear things. The echo of Eleanor's whisper, his father's voice telling him he'd brought shame on the family, the distant cries of his brother who had drowned. His mind turned against him, painting the walls with shadows, dragging him back into the night of the storm again and again. Sometimes he imagined surrendering, letting the sheriff take him, ending it quickly. Other times, he dreamed of finding Eleanor and forcing her to admit the truth, that she had wanted this all along. But Eleanor would never admit it. She played her role too well. When townspeople came to comfort her, she let her hands tremble just enough to earn their sympathy. When she spoke of her father, she chose her words carefully, crafting the image of a devoted daughter torn apart by tragedy. Her reputation, once clouded by whispers of rebellion, grew saintly in the public eye. The legal noose tightened quickly. The sheriff swore to drag Daniel in alive if he could, but the rumors in town grew darker. Some believed Eleanor had already hired men to finish what Daniel had started, to kill him quietly and dispose of his body in the swamp where so many others had vanished. Whether it was true or not, the fear kept Daniel moving, never staying in one place long enough to be found. The psychological toll spread far beyond the two of them. The Langfords shrank into shadows, ashamed and broken. Children at school whispered cruel rhymes about Danny. Elle's curse, about how he would never see another birthday. Friends who had once shared drinks with him avoided his name altogether. Even the Harrison servants, who had quietly despised Henry in life, now walked with bowed heads, afraid to let the truth slip from their mouths. The crime became a mirror for the town. Every person saw what they wanted in it. For some, it was proof of the curse, that no Langford could live without dragging death behind them. For others, it was a reminder of the town's rot, the way power and fear twisted everything beyond recognition. And for a few, it was a warning that in Black Hollow, no one ever truly escaped the fate carved out for them. In the end, the aftermath of Henry Harrison's death wasn't just about Daniel or Eleanor. It was about the entire town unraveling one thread at a time, each person caught in the ripples. Denial turned into gossip. Gossip turned into silence. And silence in Black Hollow was always the loudest sound of all. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the thunder. Black Hollow woke to the news of Henry Harrison's death with a collective shudder. The air itself seemed to carry the story, passed from porch to porch, from whispered voices in the store to hushed conversations in the churchyard. People didn't ask if it was true. They only asked how it had happened and what would happen next. In the Harrison estate, the air was thick with grief that felt rehearsed more than real. The servants moved quietly, scrubbing at the floorboards where the blood had soaked deep, though no amount of scrubbing could erase the dark stain. They spoke little, and when they did, it was in half sentences, as if finishing the thought would summon something they didn't want to see. Eleanor drifted through the house like a ghost, pale and calm, her face unreadable. Some said she was too calm for a daughter who had just lost her father. Others excused it, saying shock had frozen her grief in place. The Langfords, meanwhile, bore the weight of shame. Daniel's mother shut her doors and refused to answer the knocks that grew louder with each passing day. Neighbors who once offered help now crossed the street to avoid her window. She clung to the belief that her son wasn't a murderer, that he had been provoked or tricked, or perhaps that the curse had finally tightened its grip on him. Still, every night, she sat by the window, waiting for him to appear, her eyes hollowed by the knowledge that if he did, it would only mean more pain. Daniel himself became a shadow, hiding in the woods, slipping from one abandoned shack to another. He lived with the echo of the moment he drove the knife into Henry's chest. He couldn't eat without tasting blood, couldn't sleep without hearing Eleanor's whisper in the storm. His thoughts swung wildly between justification and despair. Some nights, he told himself it had been survival, that Henry would have killed him if he hadn't struck first. Other nights, he admitted to himself that there had been something else in him that night, something darker, something that had wanted Henry dead even before the gun was drawn. Eleanor wore her tragedy like a crown. When she stepped into town for the first time after the funeral, people lowered their eyes. Some saw her as a victim, a daughter robbed of her father by a man she should never have trusted. Others couldn't shake the way she carried herself. Not broken, not weak, but strong in a way that unsettled them. Whispers followed her down the street. That she had planned it. That she had wanted her father gone. That she had guided Daniel's hand as much as the storm had. None of it was said loudly. No one dared. She was a Harrison, and with Henry gone, her word was law. The sheriff, caught between duty and fear, began his search for Daniel with public determination but private hesitation. He knew the town expected him to drag the boy in, to see him hanged as swiftly as possible. But he also knew Daniel's crime was only part of the story, and many of the town's secrets would not survive the light of truth. The search parties combed the swamps and woods, lanterns glowing like restless fireflies, but Daniel always stayed one step ahead. Some said it was luck. Others whispered the curse was protecting him, drawing out his suffering instead of ending it quickly. Public opinion is divided. In the tavern, over drinks, men muttered that Henry had deserved it, that years of cruelty had finally caught up to him. In the church pews, women shook their heads and prayed louder, saying murder could never be justified, not even against a man like Henry. The children, too young to understand, made cruel rhymes about Daniel, about knives and curses, their voices carrying down the dusty streets. Every corner of Black Hollow buzzed with the crime until it felt as though the entire town was trapped in its shadow. The emotional toll sank deep into everyone it touched. Daniel's mother wasted away, clinging to memories of her sons. One drowned, one gone mad, and only silence left to comfort her. Eleanor's calm became something darker, a sharpness that frightened even those closest to her. She rarely spoke of her father, and when she did, it was in measured tones, as if she was reciting a story she had already told too many times. In the privacy of her room, though, she let her mask slip. She stared at the stain on her dress, folded away in a drawer, and touched it with reverence, as though it was the only proof she had that something had truly changed. The wider community began to fracture under the weight of the crime. Long-standing grievances resurfaced, old debts grew heavier, and trust frayed. If Henry Harrison could be struck down in his own home, then no one was untouchable. People locked their doors earlier, spoke softer, and carried their fears like burdens. The swamp, once simply a backdrop to their lives, seemed to grow more menacing, its shadows deeper, its silence heavier. Daniel's name became both a curse and a cautionary tale. Parents used it to warn their children of the dangers of defiance, of stepping beyond the bounds set by family and town. Yet for some, it carried a whisper of something else, an idea of rebellion, of escape, of breaking chains even at the cost of ruin. He became both villain and martyr, depending on who told the story. That in the end, the aftermath wasn't just about a single crime. It was about how Black Hollow absorbed it, twisted it, and carried it forward. Henry Harrison's death didn't free the town. It bound it tighter, every person more aware of the fragility of their lives and the weight of their secrets. Daniel hid, broken and hunted. Eleanor stood, powerful and unreadable. The town whispered, mourned, judged, and feared. And through it all, the unspoken truth lingered like a shadow over every house, every heart. In Black Hollow, no one lived past 30. Some said Daniel was already marked, that it was only a matter of time before the curse claimed him, too. Others believed Eleanor had stepped into her father's place, her control woven tighter than his had ever been. Whatever the truth, the crime had not ended with Henry's last breath. It had only begun to spread, pulling everyone deeper into the darkness that Black Hollow had always carried. The story of Black Hollow does not end neatly, nor does it provide the kind of clean answers that outsiders often crave when staring into the aftermath of tragedy. For those who lived within the town, justice was not a word that could be measured by verdicts, nor could closure be reached through prison sentences. It was something heavier, tangled in grief and silence, and it lingered in the air like the thick fog that never seemed to leave the valley. After the dust of trials and investigations settled, what remained were broken families, neighbors who no longer trusted each other, and a community that would forever carry the shadow of what happened. The families of the victims were left hollowed out, their lives cut down to routines of grief that stretched into endless years. Some clung to anger, finding comfort in blaming those who had acted or failed to act. Others retreated inward, unable to speak of what had happened without unraveling. For those who had once been close to Elias Marrow, there was no easy way to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster he became in their eyes. Old friends avoided mentioning his name, yet they could not forget the dinners shared, the laughter once exchanged. It was the kind of betrayal that carved wounds deeper than the crime itself. That in court, the proceedings were long and merciless. Witnesses took the stand, unraveling memories that shook the room with every word. Elias's wife, broken but resolute, described the years of subtle cruelty, the control, the way his temper built like a storm that no one could escape. Neighbors recalled the unease they felt but never acted on, their voices cracking as they admitted their silence. Prosecutors painted Elias as the architect of fear, while his defense tried to twist his actions into desperation, claiming the weight of expectations and financial ruin drove him beyond reason. The truth lay somewhere between madness and method, but hardly mattered. What mattered was the blood spilled, the lives ended, and the children who would never grow beyond the age of 30, a curse that seemed to echo louder in the courtroom than any testimony could. When the verdict was finally read, justice was pronounced in words, but it did little to soothe the deep ache of loss. Elias was sentenced, his legacy reduced to the crimes that bore his name. Yet for many, it was not enough. Prison walls could contain his body, but they could not contain the whispers of fear he had unleashed, nor erase the fact that the town had let itself believe in him for too long. His punishment was both final and insufficient, leaving the community to wrestle with whether justice had truly been served or whether true justice ever existed in such cases. Public opinion fractured, as it often does. Some condemned the town itself, saying Black Hollow's insular ways had allowed secrets to fester unchecked. Others pitted Elias, framing him as a man broken by circumstance rather than purely evil. The newspapers loved the story, splashing the words, "Why no one lies past age 30 in Black Hollow" across their front pages, feeding into the legend that had long defined the town. Outsiders consumed the tale as if it were folklore, something distant and unreal, never grasping the human wreckage left behind. For those within Black Hollow, it was no story. It was the ruin of their lives, turned into headlines for the world's consumption. In the years that followed, the town became a study in silence. Families who once gathered for festivals stayed apart. Homes were sold, and the younger generation fled, unwilling to inherit the weight of history. The church pews thinned, the school classrooms echoed with fewer voices, and the graveyard grew larger than the living center of town. Those who remained spoke of curses, of sins passed down through generations, of the cruelty of fate. Yet underneath the superstition was something simpler and far darker. The reality of human weakness, the ease with which power corrupts, and the cost of silence when faced with cruelty. The legacy of Black Hollow's tragedy forced the outside world to confront uncomfortable truths. How often do small towns hide their shadows behind polished smiles? How often do families excuse cruelty until it explodes into violence? And how easily does wealth and power shield those who abuse them until the damage is irreversible? These were questions that lingered far beyond the courtroom, reaching into debates about domestic violence, about the justice system's blind spots, about the ways in which society overlooks the cries for help until it is too late. In the end, Elias Marrow was just one man, but his actions laid bare the fragile threads that hold communities together. His crimes expose the rot that grows when fear and silence become stronger than truth. And though his name is now buried beneath the weight of condemnation, the scars he left remain in the lives of those who survived. The children who grew up in his shadow carry that mark, their innocence stolen long before their time. Wives and husbands who watch their partners destroyed by the chaos live with regrets they can never shake. The town itself, once quiet and proud, became a warning. One whispered in hushed tones about what happens when power is unchecked and fear becomes SD. Ringier, then love. Black Hollow became more than a place on a map. It became a parable of human nature, a reminder that justice is not always clean, that morality is rarely clear, and that evil does not always wear the face of a stranger. Sometimes it lives beside us, in our homes, in the people we trust the most. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all. The darkness is never far, and it thrives when no one dares to speak its name. The story of why no one lived past 30 in Black Hollow is not one that can be tied with a neat ribbon. It is not about curses or fate, but about choices, silence, and a human hunger for control. It is a story of a community that looked away until it was too late, and of lives that were stolen in the shadows of their own homes. And while time may soften the sharpest edges of grief, it does not erase the truth. Black Hollow will always stand as proof that the cost of silence is measured in lives lost, and that sometimes justice, even when served, leaves nothing but ashes behind.